Hello, and welcome to another edition of Coffee with Comrades, a podcast discussing current events, theory, and action through a radical lens. What's good, y'all? This week we begin a new Coffee with Comrades mini-series. Patreon supporters will already be somewhat familiar with this three-part series, but as promised, here at Coffee with Comrades, we don't want to leave anything behind a paywall indefinitely. So, we're pleased to bring you the first in a three-part primer mini-series on socialism, communism, and anarchism. But first, some announcements. As always, Coffee with Comrades is a proud member of the Rev Left Radio Federation and the Channel Zero Network. Check out this jingle from our comrades, and it's going down.
It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying, there is no running, there is no hiding, there's only fighting or dying. It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying, there is no running, there is no hiding, there's only fighting or dying.
It's Going Down is a digital community center from anarchist, anti-fascist, autonomous, anti-capitalist, and anti-colonial movements. Our mission is to provide an autonomous and resilient platform to publicize and promote revolutionary theory and action.
Go to itsgoingdown.org for daily updates. Check out our online store for ways to donate, and rate and follow us on iTunes if you like this podcast.
If you dig this program, you can sign up to become a monthly sustainer of Coffee with Comrades by going to www.patreon.com/Coffee with Comrades. For as little as $1 a month, you can sign up to unlock some sweet bonus perks, behind-the-scenes content, early access, our Discord forum, zines, and so much more. Now, a lot of listeners who are new to left politics have asked us in the past to do introductions to the major theoretical and ideological positions on the broad left. And the good news is we've done just that. Last year, I sat down with some friends and comrades in the Center for Participant Education to outline in really broad strokes the differences between socialism, communism, and anarchism. And what you'll hear today is the first of those dialogues. This edition of the podcast is all about the economics, politics, and philosophical perspectives of socialism as it is construed, and again, the broadest sense of the word. I talk about Marxism, labor, and I try to distinguish socialism from communism, as a lot of times people use these terms interchangeably without recognizing that there are actually some pretty distinct and important differences between the two terms. Keep in mind, this is all coming from someone who falls pretty firmly into anarchic tendencies, so take everything I say here with a grain of salt. I encourage you, first and foremost, to investigate different positions on the revolutionary left for yourself and think critically about those ideas so that you can come up with your own convictions and conceptions. Just the same, I hope this mini-series paints each of these distinct philosophies in a fair, clear, and concise light so that you can hopefully begin to understand and distinguish the differences between these complex and complicated philosophies in your own words. Also, if you think it would be helpful, you can check out the PowerPoints for each of these introductory philosophical episodes by going to the show notes. So, without further ado, I'll get out of your way. Please enjoy episode 103 of Coffee with Comrades, Socialism, a Broad Introduction.
Bismillah. Hey, showing living by the G code. What the is fleek though? Don't ask them, what do he know? What I forgot is better than whatever they remember. Never mind, I'm off it, it's quiet form. Time to put the temper tantrums to the quiet corner. Hush. That's enough, said the ruler. No suckers allowed to break bread or asunder. The daylight, lightning, and the thunder. Sun, moon, and stars, and the hunger. Abundance in bundles, lessons and troubles. Towers and tunnels, views and valleys, waves and peaks. Streets you from, son, planet Earth. And ain't scared of no Mars attack. What type of bars is that? Stay off my chat. I'm out they corny riot garments. Top 5 diet on and on them. Superfly, slicker, top rope. Equals diving on them. You why you lying, homie? You won't play with my emotions, Smokey. Big chief, heart rate, big beat, B-E-Y, I seen straight jacket, come clean, big said it was a dream. Now it's a living thing, with you and living kings, I mean it, I mean it, I mean. Y'all seen it, y'all seen in the R-E-B. I mean it, I mean. Original nation, with on solid, I mean it, I mean. Straight jacket, come clean, y'all seen it, y'all seen. In the R-E-B. Original nation, with on solid, we're with true and living, you know we're true and living.
So before we get started, I guess I'll just say welcome. This is the first CPE class of the semester. For those of you who don't know, CPE supports a wide range of free peer-to-peer educational programming, DIY workshops, skill shares, political theory and history, all kinds of activities really. We have a lot of stuff coming up. Some of you already have some of our literature. You can feel free to just take them on your way out, or if you want to, even look at them in the middle of the presentation. Yeah, so Socialism is a class that we have offered before at CPE. Last year we tried to offer it again and we weren't able to have it, so we're super excited to have it. Thank you all so much for being here. This is Pearson, and he's going to lead our discussion.
Cool. Well, welcome everybody. We're happy that you're here. We're stoked to have this first class of CPE, and we're glad that you're all here. Thank you guys so much for coming out. This is our first class of the semester, and it's great to see so many new folks here to hang out and learn together. Aaron and I have been organizing CPE stuff for I've been in it for a year. You've been doing it for 5 years, something like that. So I don't want to speak for Aaron, but I'm pretty sure I feel confident that I can when I say that we're both amped that you guys are here. Before we get started, I want to say a couple of things. So first, this is part one of a 4-part series that I have kind of outlined on radical political theory. The whole idea is very conscious to look at gradations as we get further to the left, and then kind of wrap it up with a synthesis. So today we're going to be looking at socialism broadly. Next Monday, we're going to be looking at communism, same time, same place, next Monday. After that, we'll be talking about anarchism, and then after that, we'll be talking about social ecology. Also, keep in mind that just because these are the things that I'm saying about socialism doesn't mean that that's the end-all, be-all. There are vast, rich ideas about this particular political tradition, and by no means am I going to be able to provide you an exhaustive account of them in the next hour and a half or however long we end up spending together. So with that being said, I would encourage you to engage critically and not just listen to what I have to say and to what the other people sitting around you have to say, but to go out and read and educate yourself and listen to other folks' ideas and perspectives and opinions, especially people who are actually out in the communities doing the work. So that is the kind of caveat here at the beginning. The other thing that I do want to say, I was talking to some folks a little bit earlier, Tori and Sophia, about I hate doing lecture style stuff, but unfortunately there's a lot of jargon in here that we kind of need to unpack. So please feel free to interrupt me if you have questions, if you want to interject something, if you need clarity, if you want to challenge me in my position, all totally fine. So yeah, let's engage in this material together. So I guess a good place to begin is what is socialism? To say we live in a politically divisive moment is a massive understatement, right? Everywhere we look, people are
polarizing to the right or to the left. And the contradictions of capitalism, which is a term we're going to define here in just a moment, have become absolutely untenable, especially in the wake of, anthropogenic climate change. But yeah, the contradictions of capitalism have, at this point, become untenable, right? It is an unsustainable system of economic exploitation that is rooted in the idea of infinite growth on a finite planet. That central contradiction is becoming increasingly glaring as we march further and further into the Anthropocene. And this polarized era has given rise to both like a very rich, engagement with like the leftist tradition, broadly speaking, which is again something we're going to kind of look at and engage with here in just a moment. But it's also given rise to like really reactionary political ideologies as well, right? We've seen fascism ascendant, and we've seen, brown shirts in the streets beating people up. There was a straight pride rally in Boston this weekend. So, just like ridiculous shenanigans on the far right. But there's also very much more deadly things and horrifying things like children being locked in cages, like fascists literally setting the Amazon on fire. These are things that I think it's important that we engage with and combat because our lives depend on it. It's not hyperbole to say so. So with that being said, let's kind of dig into, kind of what is going on in our generation, right? Broadly speaking, everyone in this room kind of falls into the categories of millennials or Generation Z, right? And broadly speaking, there's a high percentage of millennials and Generation Zers who at least agree in principle with socialist ideals, such as universal health care, or free college, that sort of thing. And so it's obviously really important to recognize that there has been a cultural and tonal shift. But I would also suggest that the reason why that cultural and tonal shift has occurred is because of the contradictions of capitalism, which we're going to get to in just a moment. It's not just a weird phenomenon. It's not just because it's cool. It's not just because of the internet. It's because of very specific materialist reasons that our society has been pushing young people in particular towards this type of tradition and this type of political organizing. I also think it's important that we talk about what socialism isn't, because before we can grasp what socialism is, we have to understand what it's not, right? So socialism is not people standing in long lines waiting for food. It's not everyone having to be assigned a job by the government that they hate to do. It's not whenever the government does stuff. I've seen people say that socialism is when the government does. That's not what socialism is. It's not the government telling you what to do. It's not state-sponsored redistribution. People might take umbrage with me saying that, but I'm standing by it. A lot of people on planet Earth are very invested in making sure that socialism is a term that is misunderstood, right? And they want to make sure that it's misunderstood because their class interests depend on it, right? Their ability to continue owning the means of production and exploiting workers for their crusade of endless profit depends on socialism being a demonized taboo word, right? And so in order to kind of dig into that, we have to kind of begin to open our minds and begin to dismantle some of these ideas about what socialism is. So in order to dig deep, the only place that we can start, the place that makes the most sense, the place that perhaps the left owes almost its entire vision to, is Marx. Albert Camus, in his essay The Rebel, says this: in the history of philosophy, there was perhaps no one more misunderstood, more bastardized than Karl Marx. Marx, if you guys haven't heard, his name's been thrown around a lot lately. We've been hearing things like cultural Marxism in our university settings, which is a laughable concept. And it's also an anti-Semitic dog whistle, so there's that too. But in order to dig into Marxism, and in order to understand socialism, we have to know Marxism. And again, this is super surface level stuff. This is meant to be an overview. it's meant to be introductory. And so a lot of this is going to be defining terms. But first, we got to look at the history of the moment. So the French Revolution happened, right? We've all been taught about the French Revolution. We've all heard stories about it. We know, generally speaking, that painted in broad brushes that the monarchy was overthrown, that there were these principles of liberté, égalité, and fraternité, which came through capitalism, right? It was a triumph of liberalism over monarchism. I think a lot of folks these days who are actually socialists call themselves liberal because they've never heard the term socialist or don't know what it actually means, right? And so I think part of today is going to be deconstructing the idea of liberalism and proposing, a more radical, more progressive vision of what I think a lot of folks are calling themselves, which is socialist. And so, we fast forward to the 19th century and we see clearly that capitalism was not able to bring about liberté, égalité, or fraternité. And in fact, there was vast pollution, inequality, there was sickness and pestilence everywhere. And the revolutions of the 19th century were symptomatic of widespread unrest in Europe, in Germany, and France, and Prussia. And onto this scene, writing pamphlets, writing ideas, sharing his perspectives on capitalism, was Marx. Now, Marx was born in May 5th, 1818 in Prussia, which is the weird fusion area between between Germany and Russia that used to exist as part of a larger empire. He was a philosophy student. He was specifically interested in Kant and idealism, and he ended up challenging the Kantian perceptions and sort of undermining them and producing a new way of looking at the world that wasn't idealist but was instead materialist. He was part of a tumultuous time in European history, and while living in Paris, he was directly inspired by the Paris Commune, which occurred in, I want to say, 1848. And the Paris Commune was an effort for people to come together to overthrow the ruling class and to share all of their goods in common. There are many critiques of why it failed. We're not going to get into those today, but eventually it was smashed by the French aristocracy. The French ruling class came back in. There was a massacre. The French killed their own people. There were hundreds of people who were killed by the army of France. And Karl Marx was really radicalized by this and realized that this sort of thing was a habitual hallmark of capitalism, that it necessarily engendered these types of crises. And so Marx, disagreed with the theories of contemporary economists of his time. He wanted to present a nuanced critique of capitalism, one that wasn't simply cheerleading it, but one that was instead invested in trying to understand how it actually functioned. And in order to do that effectively, he needed to incorporate one crucial element into his analysis, and this element was labor. Now, Marx's objectives were pretty straightforward. First, he wanted to, like I said, develop an analytical framework that was critical of capitalism. His whole goal was to sort of critique economists like Adam Smith and James Mill. He ended up writing this book called Theories of Surplus Value, which essentially tried to look at different types of economic paradigms that were existent in his world and trying to see how and why they functioned in the particular way that they did. Again, it was rooted in this sort of materialist analysis of the way that the world actually works. For reference, are folks familiar with those terms, idealism and materialism? Can someone give us a working definition? What is idealism?
Are we going off Kant here?
Yes.
Okay. So, well, Kant, wasn't he sort of a deontologist?
Mm-hmm.
And basically he was... are we going to get into the categorical imperative?
We can if you want to.
Oh, well, the categorical imperative basically is the idea that there are set universal rules to be followed. For instance, that basically if the antithesis is impossible or illogical, you have to follow that universal rule. For instance, you can't kill others because if the categorical imperative of to not kill. If it was the inverse, to kill, there would be no such thing as human life.
Great. So, idealism. Thank you. What was your name again?
My name is Dylan.
Dylan. Awesome. Thank you, Dylan. So that's idealism in a very small nutshell. Very good. But Marx rejects this, right? So then, if that's the case, what is materialism? Can somebody give us a definition of that term?
Can you?
I can, but I'm curious if other folks are interested in interjecting.
Something like truth, or like the standard by which you evaluate whether you should or shouldn't do something, actually depends on the material conditions that surround you.
Yes, absolutely. So it's taking into account the world around you, and then trying to respond to it in a way that makes sense, and trying to pull it all in, pull in all those details, pull in all the evidence and data that you can, and then proceed forward, rather than to proceed from some lofty, distant ideal. Instead, we are proceeding directly from the evidence that presents itself in the world. Does that make sense?
So it says he was a critic of Mill, so does that mean he was against things like utilitarianism?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. And like I said,
So it's James Mill, it's not John Stuart Mill.
Oh, crap.
Which is, I mean,
it's been a long
many Mills.
It's okay. He was. I would say he was opposed to utilitarianism, generally speaking. Now, there are certainly communist projects that aren't, but I would argue that Marx is. If you read Marx. So that being said, as I mentioned earlier, the conclusion that Marx eventually came to was that the missing component was labor. So let's break down what he means by labor. So in all societies, right, every society that's ever existed, there are people who work. Now, work can be loosely defined as using your mind or your body to transform materials into products that are useful for human consumption. So, I know this might seem like an elementary question, but what are some examples of work?
Making sandwiches.
Making sandwiches. Excellent. Stephen's wearing a Jimmy John's shirt, so I'm sort of well acquainted with that particular type of work. Other forms of work.
Raising children.
Raising children. Labor. Yes, absolutely. But let's be specific. Yeah. What are some other forms of labor? Other forms of work?
Textiles.
Textiles. Excellent. Sex. What else? Teaching. Yes, all of these are forms of work, right? We are people using their minds or their bodies to transform materials into products for use that are useful for human consumption. That's kind of a reductionist definition, but it's a good working definition for us today. The next thing that we need to understand is that workers always create, well, not always, I shouldn't say always. Workers in industrialized capitalist society tend to create surpluses, right? And there are, of course, forms of agrarian and pre-industrial societies that created surpluses as well. But a surplus is important to understand as well, because a surplus is sort of the crucial crux around which the concept of class, which we're going to discuss here in just a moment, functions. The surplus, it can be loosely defined as when workers are producing more than they individually consume, right? So, for example, let's take Stephen's example of sandwiches, right? If Stephen is able to make 10 sandwiches, is he going to be able to eat all those sandwiches in one day? Probably, but would it be healthy?
No.
No, I don't think so, right? What was another? So textiles. If we were spinning cloth and we had reams and reams and reams of cloth, even if we wanted to create our entire wardrobe, we'd probably still have plenty of cloth left over that we could use for other types of things, right? And so this is what is called a surplus. And a surplus is, again, very important because it's the crucial thing about which all the concept of class functions. Because the decision has to be made, right? How is society going to choose to distribute the surplus that workers have created, right? The workers are always the ones who create the surplus. It's not the ruling class, it's not the bourgeoisie who create the surplus. It is always the workers who create the surplus. So, in order to understand how this functions, we also need to understand this concept called the means of production. How many folks have heard this term thrown around before, right? So, means of production is obviously a very important concept in the history of leftist philosophy, and especially within the concept of Marxism. So the means of production can be loosely described as the facilities and the resources for producing goods. And what I mean by that is this. So who gets to decide what happens to those 10 sandwiches? Who gets to decide what happens with all the surplus cloth of the text? The person who gets to decide owns the means of production, right? They have both the facilities, they own the actual factory or the sandwich shop, or they own the loom and a textile mill where the textiles are being functioned. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And this is incredibly crucial because this is the central sort of flaw in capitalism as Marx sees it. So, we can look at 5 different forms of social organization that allow us to kind of think through these questions, right? We can look at agrarian societies, slave societies, feudalism, capitalism, and communism. Now, while some Orthodox Marxists, and to a lesser degree Marx himself, put these on a linear gradation and scale, I want to propose to you that these are not actually unique things, and in fact that they're often fluid and dynamic and interrelated, and you can have multiple things happening simultaneously in any given society. I think this is very important to understand because, first of all, if that's not possible, then what the fuck are we doing? We're probably all doomed. And second of all, that's just like an honest and sort of on the point analysis of where we're at as a society. We can see many of these things happening in our own society. So, in an agrarian society, who works? Everyone. Right? Everybody is going to be, more or less everybody's going to be working, right? Maybe the infirm, maybe the elderly, maybe the disabled may not be able to, but generally speaking, everyone in an agrarian society is going to be able to work. If there's a society if the agrarian society creates a surplus, who is that surplus going to be distributed to?
The nobility, monarchy, oligarchy, whoever's ruling.
So you're getting ahead of yourself. You're thinking about feudalism. I like where your head's at, but we're not quite there yet, right? It's possible in agrarian. There are different forms of agrarian societies, right? There are agrarian societies that were deeply patriarchal. There were agrarian societies that were deeply matriarchal. There were agrarian societies that were actually forms of proto-communism. And so if we actually look at the anthropological evidence that exists, it depends on the agrarian society that we are looking at. The surplus can be distributed in different ways, and who owns the means of production, again, can kind of be in a gray scale. Slavery, it's a little bit more obvious, right? So in slavery, in a society that utilizes slavery, who works? Slaves, right? That's the whole idea, right? The people who are enslaved. The United States was built on chattel slavery. It was this entire country came out of that tradition, and we can't escape it until we abolish this country. Who receives the surplus in a slave society? The people who are the masters, right? The people who own the slaves, right? How is that surplus distributed? Is it distributed back to the slaves? Is it given to them freely after they have given it over to the masters?
No, it's kept.
It's usually kept, right? It's held on to by the masters, right? And who owns the means of production in this society? The masters, right? So feudalism. Where our friend was at, right? In a feudal society, who works?
The peasants.
Serfs.
Peasants, serfs, exactly. Who receives the surplus?
The king or the noble.
The king or the noble, the duke, whoever it is that owns the actual land, right? Whoever is leasing the land out to the peasants or the serfs. How is that surplus distributed? Is it given back to the serfs and the peasants?
It's kept equally among the nobility.
It's usually kept equally among the nobility, right? There are different gradations there, of course, but generally speaking, and if that's the case, who owns the means of production? Nobility, right? Now we get into something that we are all living under now. Capitalism, who works?
The laborers.
Laborers, right?
The proletariat.
The proletariat, yes. The proletariat. And who receives the surplus? The bourgeoisie, yes. And we're getting ahead of ourselves, but this is great. How is the surplus distributed? Is it given back to the workers, or is it hoarded by the bourgeoisie?
It's hoarded by Jeff Bezos.
It's hoarded by Jeff Bezos, the top, right? The ruling class. And they, of course, on the means of production as well, right? Whoever, generally you can see generally speaking, how the surplus is distributed is generally dependent upon who owns the means of production. That's generally how that works. And now finally under communism. In communism, who works? We may not get there yet, but I'm curious what you guys think. Under communism, who works?
Everybody who can.
Everyone who can.
Everyone who can. What else? Other thoughts? Who would work under communism?
Whoever the master wants to work, I think.
Okay. Other thoughts? No one? That would be the ideal. That's the communist world that I want to fucking live in. I want to live in fully automated, gay, luxury space communism. That's what I want, right? Okay, that's the world that I'm looking for. I'm looking for a world where work is abolished, and I'm not kidding. I'm being very serious, right? Like I'm looking for my goal, right? Our goal shouldn't be to be drudgery of work like in factories for the rest of our lives. We shouldn't glorify the proletariat. Like the goal should be to abolish class. We don't want to have a dictatorship of the proletariat. We want to destroy class altogether, right? That is what communism is. It's a classless, stateless society. Yeah.
So how do you propose destroying class?
So this is a great question, and it's a hard one, right? And there are many different ways that we can walk through it, right? And part of this series that we're doing, this 4-part series, is to look at different ways that different people have proposed the abolition of class. So we're going to dig into that question a lot in our communism one. We're going to dig into it a lot in our anarchism one, and we'll talk about it loosely in social ecology. So I love where your head's at. It may escape the purview of today's kind of discussion, but that's an excellent question, and there's a lot of debate on it, and we should dig into that when we can give more time to it. Sound fair? Cool. So in communism, who receives the surplus?
The workers.
Everybody receives it. The workers who are working, everyone would receive it. How is the surplus distributed?
Equally.
How many people have heard the phrase, from each according to their ability to each according to their need, right? That whole idea, right? And then finally, who owns the means of production in a communist society?
The workers.
Everyone, right? The workers, everyone. No, you're good.
I'm just stuck on work because I got work tomorrow.
No, it's good. I think that we're traditionally trained to think about communism as being the dictatorship of the proletariat, as being the workers. But I want to challenge us. I want to challenge us to push forward and to push beyond that vision, because I think it's important. Other people might disagree with me. Other people might think that is itself idealist. I have some arguments for why it's actually a very materialist plan of organizing ourselves, but that is coming in future iterations of this course. So with that being said, let's talk about what capitalism is, right? So in capitalism, it's important to understand that the worker, his or herself, is not property. If they were, they would be slaves, right? People talk about wage slavery, and in many ways, workers become wage slaves, especially as capitalism becomes exacerbated and becomes forms of really stratified hyper-capitalism or fascism. But generally speaking, under capitalism, even if we're talking about the ideal form of capitalism, the worker, his or herself, is not property, and they're not tied to the land. That means that they can move around and go to whoever's going to pay them best, right? That's the whole idea of artificial scarcity, or of scarcity, is that you're able to go to people who are going to pay you more, right? That's how it works on paper, at least, right? And so the idea then is that the worker is going to enter into a labor contract. They are going to say, I will work for you, boss, in exchange for money, and all of my output, everything that I produce, is going to be your property. If I take some of that stuff that I actually produce with my own hands, with my blood, sweat, and tears, then that's actually theft, because it doesn't belong to me anymore, because you are instead paying me a wage, right? And it's important to recognize that the worker can never be paid what he or she is actually worth, because if they were paid what he or she was actually worth, there would be no surplus from their labor, right? The entire idea of capitalism functions upon the idea that the surplus is being extrapolated to the ruling class, right? And so workers necessarily cannot actually be paid what they are worth. You are never going to find a job under capitalism that will pay you what you are worth. the worker must also produce more than he or she is paid. Again, otherwise the business fails, right? A lot of businesses fail because they can't create a surplus, right? The entire way that businesses work under capitalism is that they must generate surpluses. This is one of the reasons why it's so hard for small businesses to succeed under capitalism, is because they have to create surplus after surplus after surplus after surplus. And oftentimes in order to do that, they must do pretty unethical shit in order to make that actually happen. So this inequality where producers receive none of the surplus value that they generate is the very basis, it is the foundation of capitalism. And so it's important that we recognize ultimately that workers are the people who produce and capitalists are people who own and distribute. A lot of people who are bootlickers, who like capitalism, who are on the right, will call themselves capitalists. But that's because they don't actually understand how economics works, right? You can't be a capitalist unless you own and distribute the means of production. That is how you are a capitalist. If you have the means of production, if you own your own business, if you are putting out, if you are taking in the surplus and deciding how that's distributed, then you are a capitalist. But otherwise, you can subscribe to the political theory of capitalism, you can lick its boots, but you're not actually a capitalist yourself. Does that make sense? So you had a question.
So if you're the owner of like a land developing company, you're a capitalist.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So if you have somebody who lives in a rural place who opens a restaurant and owns it and employs people and makes a profit off of their labor, would you say that they are a capitalist in the same way that like the owner of a multinational or like bigger scale business is, or do you think that more local self-organizing generation of profit is a different kind of capitalism, or what are your thoughts on that?
What do you guys think?
It's still capitalism.
I mean, Marx thought that you could be comfortably exploited. Like, it's still exploitation in some form, but it can be comfortable. Like, you can be afforded.
Oh yeah.
I thought you were gonna interject. No, but like just there's, I guess, like different levels of exploitation that can be more or less severe, depending on.
You were going to say something as well.
Yeah, the same thing. Capitalism doesn't have an asterisk, I guess. Like, it's not capitalism except if I like doing it, it's still capitalism no matter what.
Sure.
Well, what if like the business owner, like a cafe owner, just makes enough surplus for them to like pay all their bills and like keep the place running? That's still capitalist.
What do you guys think?
I think it's still capitalist, but I think there might be like, I think when it gets to a certain level where like Amazon is huge, and at that point we attach like a certain like malice to it. But if we're talking about this small time cafe where maybe they only pay them enough to have just a little bit of surplus to keep the business going, we don't attach as much like ire to it. But I think that objectively it's still capitalism.
Yeah, if we're making a materialistic
but we don't have to be as
analysis.
angry at it as in Amazon.
Yeah, Denzel.
Yeah, they're the petty bourgeoisie. They're the people who have power and exploit people, but not as much power as necessarily the direct capitalists. Yes, there might be a few people of the petty bourgeoisie who are kind, who are nice, but we know that capitalism has a tendency to monopolize. We know that in a capitalist society, these petty bourgeoisie, these small cafes and businesses will eventually be brought up by bigger businesses. So even if you are nice, you're probably going to get bought out. Because the way capitalism works, because the whole invisible hand theory, there is a truth to it. There is an invisible hand for the capitalists. Right now, they're constantly fighting and vying for power with each other. However, the more coercive and the more ruthless people will always be the ones who win out. So even if you're petty bourgeoisie and you're nice, you're eventually going to lose to a more ruthless capitalist.
Which is precisely because capitalism incentivizes us to be selfish. It incentivizes us to lack all scruples. It incentivizes us to throw ethics out the window. Because if you do, then you're going to make a killing, right?
Yeah, I also wanted to point out that Marx had made a great point wherein it also encourages social stratification, wherein I think he touched upon how you divide the labor up to where you go from doing, cashier, coffee making, and greeting the customers to you have one guy to greet the customers, one person to make the coffee, one person to be the cashier, because it's easier to justify paying less wages and exploiting even more.
100%.
definitely present now in the age of multinational corporations scouting out countries with the lowest wages possible.
Absolutely.
To make the cheapest product.
100%. Well said.
I want to actually clarify a question because I want to hear what you have to say about it. So the question is actually that I actually had was, would you, like you said that a worker who has affinities for capitalism is a bootlicker but not a capitalist. So I'm asking if even like the smallest scale ownership and profiteering, which is within capitalism, of course, is the owner of the small town cafe considered a capitalist, like in your definition of what a capitalist is, or are they just like a bootlicker who actually like works for the bank because they have a loan? Or
I would agree generally with the sentiments that were expressed here. I think that they are a capitalist. I think that there are gradations, of course, and I think that there are also gradations of all of these things. Again, I maybe we need to go back to this slide. Again, these things are not fixed, right? These things are fluid, and I think that it's really important that we recognize that these things are on a scale, right? That is a what's the word I'm looking for?
Gradient.
A gradient, yeah, a sliding scale, right? That these things are not their own sort of self-contained ideas, but rather they are much larger forms of different ways that we organize society, right? So has anybody heard of like a small business tyrant before? So
small businesses are the backbone of America.
Yeah, so small businesses are known. If you've ever worked for a small business, which I have, you'll know that some of those people are the most ruthless exploiters of people on planet Earth, right?
It's like landlords.
It's like landlords. And it's important to also recognize that there are forms of collective ownership that still function within capitalist societies. So worker co-ops, for instance, right? People owning the means of production, right? Workers themselves getting to decide how the surplus is distributed. However, it still exists under the blanket of capitalism, right? They're still taking in the value form, right?
Their wage is still being exploited.
Exactly. Their labor is still being exploited. However, is it a much better setup than what most of us are doing? Absolutely, right? Because they have a far greater say over what happens in their workplace, right? This is called democratizing a workplace or worker co-ops. This is a very rich tradition. It's stuff that has happened before, and it's happening now again. So, by way of example, because this might be helpful for some kind of easing some of these questions, right? So, by way of example, let's think about Starbucks. So at Starbucks, workers make coffee all week long, and at the end of the week, the surplus value that those workers have generated is not owned by those workers. Rather, it is owned by the board of directors, the people at Starbucks who get to decide what happens to the surplus, right? And the board of directors are going to do three things, generally speaking, right? This is an oversimplification, but generally speaking, the board of directors are going to do three things, right? They're going to replace materials, so if they need to buy more coffee beans, they're going to replace and repair any machinery so that they can keep the business running, right? Got to keep it going, got to keep the gears churning. Second thing they're going to do is pay wages, right? In order to keep the workers, in order to be able to exploit workers, they have to have labor contracts, right? We talked about this whole idea where I give you a wage, now you give me the surplus value of your labor. I give you a wage, you give me the surplus value of your labor. And then they pocket the rest. That's how this works, right? A lot of times they'll invest it in certain places. They have what's called stock. But this is basically what a board of directors will do. A very small minority pockets the surplus value that is produced by the majority. And at Starbucks, this particular definition, there are 13 people who own and distribute the surplus value that is generated by over 250,000 workers. And I feel like if you show this to your conservative friends and family, if you explain it in this particular way, in a very materialist way, and you don't even have to call it capitalism, you don't even have to call it socialism, but you just explain it and say you're getting fucked by your boss, I think people are going to respond to it much more enthusiastically. And I think that this is the way that we need to engage with people on these topics. So, what is class? Now, again, so often, right, people will say that class is the rich and the poor, but this is not correct, right? It's not the middle class, it's not the upper class. That is a liberal obfuscation of a material reality, right? That is an idealist conception that is not in any way, shape, or form rooted in an economic basis, right? It is not the rich versus the poor. Class is about one thing and one thing only. It is about who owns the means of production. It is about surplus. The producing class are the people who generate surplus value and must sell their labor. We call these people the proletariat. The bourgeoisie are the owning class. They own and distribute the surplus value created and generated by the proletariat. This is the concrete conception of what class is. Again, it's not rich versus poor. It is who owns the surplus value. Does that make sense? Again, this is a materialist way of looking at the world. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question, kind of back with one of the other slides. You don't have to go back to it because this kind of falls into it. What do you do, right? So if you're at the very bottom, if you're the proletariat and you're working at Jimmy John's, or I work at a similar fast food place, this is what you do over and over. And I guess the dream or the ideal would be to be the guy at the top that gets to make the money. But at that point, then you're the person that's exploiting the guy that you used to be. Mm-hmm. So
what do we do?
What do you do? I don't want to be the guy on the bottom.
And you don't want to be the guy at the top, right? Yeah. So what do we do?
I guess the first step is to organize.
There it is. We got to organize. But what does that mean? What does it mean to organize your workplace?
250,000 people are way more popular than 13, or way more important than 13.
400.
Yeah.
Huh?
Nothing.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, Denzel.
I think there's this very good video about that Kwame Ture is kind of talking about organizing, and he kind of talks about how at the CIA, if they snap their fingers right now, they can get 50 people to go around, go on phone calls, do conversation, do all these kinds of things. But it's not because those people are more intelligent than us or those people are better than us. It's simply because they're an organized facility. If we want to be organizations, if we want to be the capitalists, we have to organize against them. Mm-hmm. We have to kind of build... How do I say?
Discipline.
Yeah, build discipline, really, honestly.
Rigor.
Discipline and rigor.
Yeah, discipline, rigor, and ultimately we need to build power, right? We need to be able to have power, right? And depending on who you ask, right, what power is can be defined as people acting together in concert, right? Those 13 people, right, who own the surplus value of the Starbucks workers, they're still working together, right? They're just a cabal of very powerful people, right? But their power comes because they have decided to work together in this particular way. They are highly organized, and because our society has rewarded their exploitation of our labor, right? But if we begin to recognize that power is not something that is top-down, but rather it is something that is created and generated by people working together, then we can begin to see how we can actually challenge that power, right? So one of the ways, the big answer to your question is to form a union. With your workers, whoever you're working with, talk to them about this exact idea that you're being fucked by your boss, and then figure out how to work together to go on strike, to figure out what your rights are, to work with other larger like unions like the International Workers of the World, the IWW, etc. There are many, many ways to organize, and that's actually something that we're going to be talking about again in this series as we move forward. Again, this is just kind of a broad overview, but I'm glad that you see that this is not something that can just be reformed. It's not something that we can just ask nicely for them to give us what we're owed, right? It's something that we are going to have to build power and take. Serena, you had a question.
Well, I just wanted to say that it's illegal for teachers to strike in Florida.
It is. It is indeed.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of tools that the bourgeoisie uses to sort of not only demonize but make completely illegal efforts of the proletarian class to seize power.
Absolutely.
And they're also, I feel like we're told from day one of our lives that we are nothing, and that the only way we can sort of make something for ourselves is labor. We work to live, and we live to work. Mm-hmm.
And it'll kill us.
Yeah, I mean, literally. So.
Literally, we are working ourselves to a grave. And I don't know about I don't know about y'all, but I don't want to work for the rest of my life. I want to self-actualize, which is again something we're going to talk about huge in communism. Kind of ish. Maslow is taking from Marx actually. But yes, that idea, yes, very much so.
I'm a psych major, so
there you go. Boom. Yep, self-actualizing. Aaron, you had something.
I was just going to mention that in, like, for example, the United Faculty of Florida doesn't have striking rights in their.
Neither does the Graduate Assistants Union, which I'm a part of.
on part two. So unionizing is like an answer right off the bat for certain things, but as you were saying, it's a kind of basically within a reformist model.
It is. Unions in particular are under a reformist model, which is one of the reasons why it's a good start, but it's not revolutionary, right? There are people who would argue with me until they're blue in the face about that, but I contend, and I would say that they are, in fact, a way of building revolutionary power, but unfortunately, they have not been able to do so yet successfully.
They've only been
they've always been limits, exactly. And so I think it's really important to recognize that, again, working within these boundaries of reform is not going to be able to abolish capitalism. We're not going to be able to overthrow capitalism until we organize and build power. Yeah.
I just have a question. So, does power always have to be exploitative? I don't know how to say that word. But
what do you guys think? Does power have to be exploitative?
In the context of capitalism, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
But so under the context of capitalism, Izzy is saying, Denzel, you said no. Why do you say no?
Power is only exploitative if we all don't have power. Mm-hmm. If everyone has power, then it's not exploitative. If all of us here had the same education, the same resources to learn, the same resources to grow, then we wouldn't be able to exploit each other.
It's one of the reasons why CPE does what it does. It's one of the reasons why we're sitting in a circle. It's one of the reasons why we're all talking together about this stuff, right? It's because we're trying to build power together, right? We're trying to learn together. We're trying to construct knowledge. We're trying to grow together. And education is a huge component of that. But again, even it alone is not going to be able to liberate us, right? Education can be a tool, but it's not. It's one tool in the toolbox, right? It's one part of building power. Yeah.
Okay, I'm asking this seriously, not as a joke. Do you think we need a violent revolution?
That's a great question.
I'm being serious.
Speak directly into the microphone.
I was just having a conversation about this with one of my comrades yesterday. I
You got the CRA sticker.
do not
SRA,
yes. And that's actually part of it. So Socialist Rifles Association. I believe in building power, and I think that when we build power, historically, when the proletariat builds power, they are confronted by the bourgeoisie. Sometimes they are confronted through nonviolent means, and oftentimes they are confronted through violent means, right? And I think that it is very easy to justify violence in order to say, oh, we're going to have this future revolution, we're going to build this utopia, it's going to be great. But I have very serious concerns that that's not actually going to be able to build power if we're building the same kinds of structures, if we're reifying the same kind of violence that exists in the world today, right? That being said, I'm also a proponent of self-defense, right? I recognize that if a fascist is in my neighborhood and is harassing brown folks or harassing people of color or harassing women or whatever,
like what happened after Katrina.
That exactly. Then you bet your ass we're going to show up. We're going to punch Nazis in the face. We are going to defend ourselves, right? We're going to defend ourselves. We're going to defend our communities. And when the bourgeoisie brings its boot, we're going to kick back, right? So that, to me, that form of self-defense, of community self-defense, is an acceptable form of quote-unquote violence. However, do we need violence in order to enact revolution? That is a tenuous thing. And again, that's a great question. It's something that we could debate. We put an entire class towards. But yeah, we'll table that discussion. It's something we can loop back to and more of this conversation. All right, so with that being said, now that we've gotten all that out of the way, we've looked at Marx, we've looked at what capitalism is. Now, finally, we can begin to understand what socialism is. Now, socialism is a noun. Socialism is a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. This is a policy or practice that is based on the political and economic theory of socialism. And in Marxist theory, socialism is a transitional state between the overthrow of capitalism and the realization of communism, which is, again, something we're going to talk about next week. This is the definition in the Oxford English Dictionary. I think it's a pretty good definition. It's not perfect, but I am fine with this definition. So that's socialism in a nutshell. But unfortunately, or fortunately, perhaps the way you look at it, I think forms and variation are generally good. There are many different types of socialism, right? So in order to do this effectively, we kind of got to map it, which is what we're going to do right now. All right, so if we're looking at the history of... Oh, I can't. I'm not going to draw on the board. If we're going to look at the history, right, of socialism in the world. Like, if I'm going to go up here, I can't actually draw on the wall. I can draw on the board, but... And I want to say right up front that this is an incredibly contentious thing that I'm about to do. So out of everything that I've said thus far, take all of this with a grain of salt. Because I'm coming, just perfect transparency, I'm coming from this as an anarchist, so understand that. And we're going to talk about what those things mean here later as we go on. So this is the political compass, right? It's got an XY axis. It's looking on the Y axis is looking at the top is authoritarian, at the bottom is libertarian, and the X axis is communism on the left and capitalism on the right, right? Now, many leftists, for good reason, take umbrage with this and call it an oversimplification, and in many ways I agree it is rather reductionary. But that being said, it does allow us to kind of get some ideas about these ideas and kind of put them up on a board and think about them logically. And so I guess a good place to begin, right, is we live under capitalism. My presentation, or my contention to you all, and again, this is one way of interpreting the political compass, is that everything this way is capitalism, right? So everything that is on this side of the, I always get the X and Y confused. This is why I'm a literature major.
Why?
The X-axis, everything on the X-axis that's to the right is going to be capitalism. Everything to the left is going to be communism. So where are we today? This is a question we can ask.
I would say we're more towards the authoritarian right.
Authoritarian right. Where would we put ourselves?
Pretty high up in the right corner.
Pretty high up in the right corner, right? We live under Donald Trump. I think it's fair to say that Donald Trump is, if not an outright fascist, then a proto-fascist.
We have questions about what authoritarian means.
Yes, so this is where the problems come in, right? So, so we'll get there in just a second. So, up here, right? We're calling this the authoritarian right, right? This is where we would put fascism. Traditionally, this is where fascism is grouped. It's in that top right corner. I'm not going to write on the actual wall, but it's all the way up there at the top. You take the top corner of the right. We're probably somewhere close to there at this point. Not fully there, but pretty goddamn close.
Didn't Hitler look to the U.S. to like learn about what he
Absolutely.
did?
Hitler looked specifically at the United States practice of eugenics and specifically the genocide of Native Americans to think about how to instate the Third Reich.
Didn't he also draw upon ideas of forced sterilization from the U.S.?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Is he?
I'm going to have to disagree with you there.
Okay.
If that's okay.
Yeah, silly.
I think that it's a bold statement to say that we're all the way in the authoritarian right just because Hitler looked to eugenics and the genocide of the Native Americans back then doesn't mean that we're in that state of being now.
Sure.
And I think it's quite a stretch considering that we have countries that exist now that are far more into the authoritarian right than we could ever even dream of. The fact that we're having this group right now means that we're not as authoritarian as other countries that, like Venezuela, where I'm from. Having a conversation like this within a university is unthinkable. There aren't universities over there right now that have an education that we can do this. If you lived in North Korea, China, if you're pretty much anybody that's not in the United States in a developed country, you're gonna have a hard time saying that you're not in the authoritarian right the way that, if that makes sense.
Thoughts on this?
I agree. That's good. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Oh, I would argue we're getting. I wouldn't argue that we're a completely 120% fascist state, but considering that there is legislation in place that is limiting freedom of speech from leftist organizations or left-leaning organizations, for instance, anti-BDS laws that are in place in many states across the country, as well as the use by the bourgeoisie of police force to protect their interests. Like, I think one of the greatest examples is the Dakota Access pipeline protests, wherein peaceful protesters who had the rights to that land were oppressed and beaten and arrested. I would say we're in a backsliding, nearly fascistic state in that although we aren't on the extreme end, we are locking people into cages and depriving them of basic rights.
I think maybe just because we're allowed, I feel like we're allowed our level of freedom of speech just because like the ruling class is like so confident that we can talk all we want and we're not going to be able to do anything. But yeah, what was the law that was just passed in Florida? Yeah, no criticizing Israel law.
Yep.
That was just so.
I would also say that.
Oh no, it's okay. You can finish if you like. I think it's also important to point at U.S. imperialism's actions and how they affect other countries. Yes, U.S. imperialism might not be affecting some of the people in this country because they can't. Well, some of the people in this country. Let's talk about deportations and prisons in this country and the way they treat black communities and underprivileged communities. But the U.S. is the biggest imperialist power in the world right now. We are causing devastation in many, many different countries. In North Korea, 18 out of 22 cities were burned down by the U.S. during the North Korean War in the 1950s. The United States of America has not only complete monopoly over a lot of parts of the world, but this kind of control that allows them to extort other people. So yes, we do have some more privileges and rights in this country, but it's very important to say that we have these privileges and rights because we are extorting people worldwide.
But that still doesn't argue that we're all the way on the authoritarian right. If
I don't think we are.
Right.
I don't. For the record, I don't think we're all the way in the authoritarian. Like, on top
I don't think we are.
I think we're somewhere over like here-ish.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I would agree with that.
I'm not saying we're in the top right. I'm saying we're somewhere like here abouts.
Okay.
And I want to apologize because that's what I meant.
Yeah, like that was the original place that you pointed. So
No. I was saying that I'm so sorry. I miscommunicated. That far right corner is fascism, right?
Right.
Right, and we are heading towards that, but I don't think we're there yet.
Right.
So yeah, I think that there are proto-fascistic elements in the United States today, but I don't think we're in full-fledged fascism.
I think that our existence would look very, very different if we were.
Yeah, for sure.
Just we have a president that's fat. Well, we know this, but that doesn't mean that that's where we are right now.
Yeah, I agree. Sorry, I did not mean to miscommunicate. That is my bad.
No, it's totally fine.
Stencil, go.
I just want to say that it's important to think that in a lot of Marxist theory, capitalism devolved into fascism specifically because the proletariat and working class tried to develop power. So the reason why we're devolving into fascism isn't
because we see left building.
It's because they see the left building and they're already taking those steps. You see the deportation camps. They're taking those steps to make sure we don't have the power to, when people are really realizing the corruption of the society, to revolt. So fascism is a result of kind of like the power of the left, but also the breakdown of our society and the fact that we're decaying.
Fascism is capitalism in decay, as Lenin said. So.
That's BDS.
The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement.
It's a move. It's basically in order to protest the Israeli apartheid state that's been set up. It's the idea of boycotting either pro-Israeli companies or not purchasing products of people who fund things like AIPAC, which is the American Israeli
Political Action Committee.
Thank you. Which is an entity in the government that funds Israeli forces. And to divest, which is to take funding away from them, and to sanction, which is to create
legislation.
Yeah, exactly.
So, real quick, just in the interest of time, because again, this is probably the most contentious thing that I'm talking about today, at least maybe for this one. So, there was a question about the y-axis. I always get them confused.
Okay. Mnemonic device, like put your arm. Y.
Okay.
Or like Y points down. Or like there's like a little thing.
Y has a tail.
That's so much simpler.
Okay, cool. I'm never gonna get it, but great. So there's a question about authoritarian versus libertarian, right? So a lot of Marxists, in particular, will say that it is not fair to place an authoritarian or libertarian perspective on things because I'm trying to think of the arguments that I've heard. They say that it's an oversimplification, it's an obfuscation of material reality. I think that those are hollow criticisms, personally. I think that in fact, the y-axis is actually very useful for thinking about like freedom, which is something that I really think is important. And so, we're going to return to this in the days ahead. Not again thinking of it as a fixed thing, but thinking of it as a fluid thing, right? Thinking of it as something that there's movement, there are many ways to understand these things. But the basic precept, right, the idea of this compass is to think about how political ideology works, right? That's why it was created. And it's also worth noting that, if I remember correctly, it's created by somebody who has more far, not far right, but leans towards the right. That being said, the idea, right, is that communism or capitalism is to the right, communism is to the left, and there are gradations, right? So there are forms of economic governments, or there are forms of government that have a stronger state, and there are forms of governance that have no state, right? And so those are the questions that we're going to be kind of talking about during the next couple of iterations of this class, is talking about different forms of governance, and also thinking about these terms, because this is what political theory is about, right? It's trying to figure out how do we create, well, I would say leftist political theories about how do we create communism is essentially what we're moving towards, right? And there are many, many different ways that people think about how we're going to get there. I would contend, and this is a strong contention, and people can argue with me, and that we can have that conversation next week. I don't want to have it this week because I'm not mentally prepared, but we can totally have it next week. That we have never seen communism. We have not seen that happen yet. We have seen movements towards it, we've seen gradations of it, but we have never actually seen communism. And I'm going to talk more about that, more about why that is, and my reasons for it, and my the material analysis that I'm providing for why I make that contention next week. But I would say that we have not gotten there yet. We have not seen that yet. We have seen agrarian forms of communism, of proto-communism. We have seen forms of liberated communities that are where the means of production are communally owned, but we have not seen communism on a full scale, right?
On a nationwide.
Well, that's the crucial point. Is you can't have a nation. This is what I'm going to contend to you on next week, is that you can't have a state and have communism. Communism is, by definition, stateless. So that's one of the reasons why we've never seen it yet. There are forms of stateless associations and regions and territories that are communist, but I would say that they haven't achieved the term full communism. And again, this is a very convoluted, difficult thing. People will argue about this particular idea until they're blue in the face. They'll say, yes, there are many socialist states. There's China, there's Venezuela, there's Cuba, there is the USSR, and I think that there's a lot to be learned from those projects and those experiments, but I do not think that they are socialist. And I know that is a big blanket statement, and a lot of people are welcome to disagree with it, but that is my contention. That's where I'm coming from, and so we're going to have those conversations together in class in the weeks ahead. This is a very broad overview, and so I know that there are things that people want to maybe dig in and chew in on, and we are definitely going to be doing that moving forward. And again, like I said, I'm over here, or really over here. So you have to take everything that I say with a grain of salt, because I'm coming from it from a very particular angle, right? And so be thinking about that as well, thinking about where you're at, thinking about it, whether or not you think this is even a useful tool at all. Again, all things that I'm open to discussing and talking about together. And that about does it for this week's episode of Coffee with Comrades. This is an entirely DIY show run by workers for workers. If you like what you hear, you can follow us on Twitter at CoffeeWComrades and Instagram at CoffeeWithComrades. Check out our website, www.coffeewithcomrades.com, and sign up to support our work with a monthly contribution by going to www.patreon.com/coffeewithcomrades. You can find Coffee with Comrades on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you go to get your anti-capitalist propaganda. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. While you're there, smashing that subscribe button, be sure to rate and review the show as well to help us increase our reach. If you have feedback, criticism, or you'd just like to get in touch with us, shoot us an email at coffeewithcomrades@gmail.com. Until next time, stay wild out there, comrades.
Boys working on empty. Is that the kind of way to face the burning heat? I just think about my baby. I'm so full of love I could barely eat. There's nothing sweeter than my baby. I'd never want once from the cherry tree. 'Cause my baby's sweet as can be. She'd give me toothaches just from kissing me. When my time comes around, lay me gently in the cold dark earth. No grave can hold my body down. I'll crawl home to her. Boys, when my baby found me, I was 3 days on a drunken sin. I woke with the walls around me. Nothing in her room but an empty crib. And I was burning up a fever. I didn't care much how long I lived. But I swear I thought I dreamed her. She never asked me once about the wrong I did. When my time comes around, lay me gently in the cold dark earth. No grave can hold my body down. I'll crawl home to her. When my time comes around, lay me gently in the cold dark earth. No grave can hold my body down. I'll crawl home to her. My babe would never fret none about what my hands and my body done. If the Lord don't forgive me, I'd still have my baby and my babe would have me. When I was kissing on my baby, and she put her love down soft and sweet. In the lonely light I was free. Heaven and hell were words to me. When my time comes around, lay me gently in the cold dark.